My name is Calista and I am 35 years old teaching elementary school in Boston. Growing up as the only daughter of wealthy businessman James Bennett, I always felt like an outsider in my own family. Last month, I sat silently as my father's will was read. My brothers inherited $11 million in properties, investments, and luxury items. I received only a dusty envelope. Before I tell you what was inside that envelope and how it changed my life forever, drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and subscribe if you are new here. I was born during a snowstorm in January. My mother Sarah died from complications during childbirth, leaving my father James devastated and alone with a newborn daughter he had no idea how to care for. According to my Aunt Patricia, my father was never the same after my mother died. The light went out in his eyes and he poured all his energy into building his real estate business. I became an afterthought, raised mostly by a rotating staff of nannies, while my father worked 18-hour days building the empire that would one day tear our family apart. When I was 4 years old, my father remarried. Marianne was a Boston socialite with connections to old money families and 2 sons from her previous marriage, Lucas, who was 6, and Dominic, who was 5. I remember being excited about having siblings and a new mother figure. That excitement quickly faded as I realized Marianne had no interest in being my mother. The favoritism toward her biological sons was subtle at first, but became increasingly obvious as the years passed. When the boys got new clothes, mine would arrive days later, almost as an afterthought. Family photos always positioned me slightly apart from the core family unit. At dinner, my accomplishments were acknowledged with polite nods, while Lucas and Dominic received enthusiastic praise for the smallest achievements. Our home was a 15,000 cubic feet mansion in Beacon Hill with marble floors, Calista chandeliers, and rooms I was not allowed to enter. My bedroom was on the 3rd floor, far from the family quarters on the 2nd floor. I often felt more like a guest than a daughter in my own home. The incidents of exclusion piled up over the years. When I was 8, the family took a vacation to the French Riviera, but I was sent to stay with my mother's sister in Vermont. The explanation was that the trip was for business contacts and it would be boring for a little girl. When I turned 16, both Lucas and Dominic received luxury cars with custom leather interiors. I received a generic birthday card with a 20 bill inside. Despite the emotional neglect, I threw myself into academics, believing that if I could just achieve enough, my father would finally see me. I became valedictorian of my high school class, earned a full scholarship to Harvard, and graduated summa cum laude with a degree in education. While my classmates' parents beamed with pride at graduation, my father checked his watch repeatedly and left immediately after the ceremony for a business meeting. My brothers both dropped out of college to join the family business. Lucas lasted 2 semesters at Boston University before deciding education was a waste of time. Dominic managed 3 years at Princeton before failing out and being welcomed into the company with a vice president title and corner office. Meanwhile, their mediocre business attempts were celebrated and funded while my academic achievements were treated as a curiosity at best. When I announced my decision to become a teacher, my stepmother actually laughed. My father frowned and asked if I was deliberately trying to embarrass the family. A Bennett working as a public school teacher, what will our friends think, he had asked. I replied that I wanted to make a difference in children's lives, not accumulate wealth. That was the last serious conversation we had about my career. For the past 10 years, I have lived in a modest 2-bedroom apartment in Somerville, teaching 3rd grade at a public elementary school. I live paycheck to paycheck, but I find purpose in my work that my father and brothers never seem to find in theirs despite all their wealth. My students' faces lighting up when they grasp a new concept brings me more joy than any luxury car or vacation ever could. My relationship with my brothers deteriorated into barely concealed contempt. At mandatory family gatherings like Thanksgiving and Christmas, they would acknowledge me with curt nods before returning to conversations about property values and investment opportunities. Lucas, the older one, occasionally asked condescending questions about my little teaching job. Dominic rarely spoke to me directly, preferring to talk about me in the 3rd person even when I was present. The last normal conversation I had with my father was 2 years ago at the annual company Christmas party. I had been invited as a formality and was standing alone by the dessert table, when my father approached. He had been drinking and seemed momentarily more relaxed than usual. "You could have been something, Callista," he said, gesturing around the opulent hotel ballroom. "All of this could have been partly yours." "I am something, Dad," I replied. "I'm a teacher who helps children learn and grow." He shook his head, disappointment evident in his expression. Such a waste of potential. He walked away, joining a group of business associates, leaving me alone with a half-eaten plate of chocolate cake and the familiar ache of rejection. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon during my lunch break. I was supervising the playground when my phone rang with my father's number. Expecting his assistant with some perfunctory question about an upcoming family obligation, I was shocked to hear my father's strained voice instead. "Callista, I need you to come to Massachusetts General Hospital. I've been diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Despite our complicated relationship, the news hit me hard. I arranged for emergency substitute coverage and drove directly to the hospital, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When I arrived, Lucas and Dominic were already there, huddled in a corner of the waiting room, speaking in low voices. They barely acknowledged my arrival. During the first family meeting with the oncologist, while the doctor was explaining treatment options and prognosis, I caught my brothers exchanging glances when the topic of my father's life expectancy came up. Later, I overheard them in the hallway discussing inheritance tax strategies. My father had not been officially terminal for 24 hours, and they were already dividing his assets. I took unpaid leave from my teaching position to help care for my father during his treatments. The school principal was understanding, arranging for a long-term substitute, and assuring me my job would be waiting when I returned. My brothers, despite their executive positions in the family company, rarely visited the hospital. They always had important business meetings or crucial negotiations that prevented them from sitting with their dying father. I spent hours by my father's bedside reading to him from business magazines and novels I remembered him enjoying when I was a child. As the cancer progressed and treatments failed, I found myself sharing memories of the few happy moments we had shared. A fishing trip when I was 7, the time he taught me to ride a bike, the proud nod he gave when I received my acceptance letter to Harvard. One evening, as I read from The Great Gatsby, his hand weakly reached for mine and squeezed. For a moment, I thought he might finally say something meaningful, bridge the chasm between us before it was too late. But he merely closed his eyes and drifted back to sleep. We never had the reconciliation I had always hoped for. The night my father died, I was alone with him. Lucas and Dominic were attending a charity gala representing the company. Marianne was at their vacation home in Martha's Vineyard, claiming the hospital environment was too depressing. I sat holding his hand as his breathing became increasingly labored. The monitors beeped slower and slower until they flatlined. I called for the nurse, but I knew he was gone. I sat there crying, not just for the father I had lost, but for the relationship we never had. My grief was private and raw. My brother's mourning, by contrast, was a public performance. They gave tearful interviews to local business publications about losing their mentor. They commissioned an oil painting of my father for the company headquarters. They spoke eloquently about family legacy and responsibility, all while barely acknowledging my existence. The funeral was an elaborate affair, orchestrated by my stepmother to be more of a networking event than a memorial. 500 guests in black designer clothing filled the cathedral. Business associates, political connections, and society figures came to be seen. I sat in the front row next to my brothers, feeling like an intruder at a stranger's funeral. When it came time for eulogies, Lucas and Dominic delivered polished speeches clearly written by the company's public relations team. They spoke of business acumen and family values in the same rehearsed tone. When my turn came, I spoke simply and honestly about the few genuine moments I had shared with my father, the complicated love I felt for him, despite the distance between us. My voice broke several times, and I noticed several guests wiping away tears touched by the authenticity they had not expected. At the reception afterward, I overheard countless conversations about the inheritance. Distant relatives speculated on property values. Business associates wondered about company restructuring. Family friends discussed which vacation homes might be sold off. No one seemed to be grieving the man himself, only calculating the value of what he left behind. As guests began to leave, the family attorney, Franklin Thompson, approached our small group. He was a serious man in his 60s who had managed my father's legal affairs for decades. The formal reading of the will is scheduled for next Wednesday at 10 a.m. at my office, he informed us. All named beneficiaries should attend. Lucas and Dominic nodded solemnly while Marianne dabbed at dry eyes with a black handkerchief. I simply nodded, wondering if I would even be mentioned in the will at all. That night, alone in my apartment, I allowed myself to fully feel the complicated emotions I had been suppressing. Grief for the father I wished I had known better, anger at his lifelong emotional absence, frustration that we had run out of time for the reconciliation I had always hoped would come someday, and beneath it all, a small childish hope that perhaps in death my father might finally acknowledge me as his daughter in a way he never had in life. The following Wednesday, I arrived at the imposing glass and steel office building in downtown Boston, where Franklin Thompson's law firm occupied the top 3 floors. The reception area of Thompson Greenberg and Associates featured marble floors, leather furniture, and views of Boston Harbor that reinforced the wealth and power of their clientele. Extended family members were already gathered, my stepmother, Marianne, in an expensive black dress and pearl necklace worth more than my annual teaching salary. My brothers Lucas and Dominic in tailored suits checking their phones impatiently. Aunt Patricia, my father's sister with her husband and 2 adult children, cousins from both sides of the family, and several elderly relatives I barely recognized. I had come directly from a morning of teacher conferences, wearing my best work clothes, a simple navy blue dress from a department store rack and low heels. The contrast between my modest attire and the designer outfit surrounding me was immediately apparent. Several relatives gave me thinly veiled looks of judgment, as if my clothing choice was somehow disrespectful rather than simply reflecting my means. As we waited to be called into the conference room, I overheard Lucas whispering to Dominic, followed by muffled laughter and glances in my direction. Though I couldn't hear the exact words, their expressions made it clear I was the subject of their amusement. I straightened my shoulders and pretended not to notice a skill I had perfected over the years. At precisely 10 Huntuk, Franklin Thompson's assistant invited us into the large conference room, where the attorney sat at the head of a gleaming mahogany table. We took our seats with Marianne and my brothers, positioning themselves directly across from Thompson, while I found a spot near the end of the table. Thompson began with formal condolences and an explanation of the process. His methodical approach suited the gravity of the occasion, but I could sense the impatience in the room as relatives shifted in their seats, eager to learn what they would receive. I will now proceed with the reading of the last will and testament of James Edward Bennett Thompson, announced, putting on reading glasses and opening an embossed leather folder. The distribution began with my father's business holdings. Lucas, as the eldest son, received ownership of 3 prime properties: the Boston headquarters building valued at $4 million, a commercial development in downtown Manhattan worth $3.5 million, and a recently acquired office complex in Cambridge valued at $2 million. Dominic was granted the investment portfolio valued at approximately $3 million, the 60-foot yacht docked in Boston Harbor, and my father's collection of vintage and luxury cars valued at over $1 million. Marianne received the Beacon Hill mansion where I had grown up, valued at $5 million, along with a substantial financial settlement and several pieces of fine art and jewelry. The bequests continued to more distant relatives. Aunt Patricia received a vacation property in Cape Cod. Cousins were given cash gifts ranging from $50,000 to $200,000. Even distant relatives I barely knew received valuable heirlooms and financial consideration. As the list of beneficiaries grew longer without my name being mentioned, the tension in my body increased. I maintained a neutral expression, but my hands gripped my purse tightly under the table. Across from me, I noticed Dominic's slight smirk growing with each bequest that excluded me. Finally, after nearly an hour of distributions that accounted for virtually all of my father's visible assets, Thompson cleared his throat and said, "And to my daughter Callista Sarah Bennett, I leave the contents of this envelope." He reached into his folder and withdrew a worn manila envelope slightly yellowed with age. The room fell silent as Thompson walked around the table and handed me the envelope. It was thin and light, nothing like the thick legal documents my brothers had received detailing their millions in inheritance. I felt all eyes on me as I accepted it with a quiet, "Thank you." A muffled sound that might have been a suppressed laugh came from Lucas's direction. Marianne's lips curved into a satisfied smirk that she quickly covered with a gloved hand. "Is that all?" Aunt Patricia asked loudly, breaking the awkward silence. James left his only daughter just an envelope. Thompson's professional demeanor never wavered. That is what the deceased specified in his legal will. Yes, I sat there, the envelope in my hands, feeling like it weighed 1,000 palsains. The humiliation burned through me, but years of practice hiding my emotions in this family allowed me to maintain my composure. I nodded politely, slipped the envelope into my purse, and listened as Thompson concluded the formal proceedings. As the meeting ended, relatives began gathering their documentation and discussing their windfall in excited tones. No one approached me or met my eyes. I stood alone, the invisible daughter once again. The elevator ride down to the lobby was excruciating. I stood surrounded by relatives clutching paperwork detailing millions in assets while I held nothing but my purse containing a single envelope. The silence was broken only when Lucas leaned over and whispered, "Don't spend it all in one place, sis." Dominic snickered, adding, "Maybe there's a coupon for school supplies inside. Dad always said you were practical." I maintained my dignity until I reached my 10-year-old Honda in the parking garage. Once inside, I gripped the steering wheel and allowed a few tears to fall before composing myself enough to drive. The rain had started turning Boston streets slick and gray, matching my mood as I navigated through traffic. Windshield wipers struggled to keep pace with my tears as I made my way back to my apartment, the envelope burning a hole in my purse. My apartment felt especially small and shabby that afternoon as I dropped my keys on the kitchen counter. The contrast between where I had just been with its marble and mahogany grandeur and my modest living space was stark. My furniture was second-hand, my decor from discount stores. The building had plumbing issues and neighbors who argued loudly. This was the reality of a teacher's salary in an expensive city like Boston. Once the door was locked behind me, the composure I had maintained crumbled entirely. I sank onto my couch and finally allowed myself to feel the full force of the day's humiliation. Angry tears came in waves as I relived every smirk, every whispered comment, every dismissive glance. My father's final message seemed clear, despite a lifetime of trying to earn his love and respect. I had failed. The Polry envelope was the period at the end of a sentence that had been written throughout my life. "You are not truly a Bennett." I tossed the envelope onto my coffee table, unable to bring myself to open it. What could it possibly contain that would make any difference now? A final lecture on how I had disappointed him by choosing education over business, a token sum that would only underscore how little he valued me compared to my brothers. For hours, I left it there, making dinner, grading papers, anything to avoid confronting whatever final insult it might contain. Around 9:00 p.m., I made a cup of chamomile tea and sat cross-legged on my couch, staring at the envelope. The tea grew cold as I reflected on a lifetime of disappointment. My earliest memory was reaching for my father at age 3 and having him turn away to take a business call. My 5th birthday party that he missed for a real estate closing. My high school graduation, where he checked emails during my valedictorian speech. A lifetime of trying to matter to someone who saw me as an inconvenience at best. Just after midnight, with rain still pattering against my windows, I finally reached for the envelope. My hands shook slightly as I carefully opened the sealed flap. The paper was old, the glue brittle. Inside was a single sheet of paper. I unfolded it and found what appeared to be a bank account number for a Swiss institution, followed by one line of text in my father's distinctive handwriting. "This is for the child who was never supposed to exist." I stared at the words, feeling a fresh wave of pain. Even from beyond the grave, he was reminding me that I was unwanted, that my very existence was some kind of mistake. I was tempted to crumple the paper and throw it away to reject him as finally and completely as he had rejected me. But curiosity won out. What exactly did this cryptic message mean? Was there actually anything in this account? or was this one final cruel joke? I retrieved my laptop from my bedroom and searched for the banking institution listed on the paper. It was indeed a legitimate private bank in Zurich, catering to high net worth individuals. With some hesitation, I navigated to their client portal. The site allowed for secure login using the account number and a personal identifier. After trying several combinations, including my birth date and social security number, I discovered the identifier was my mother's birth date, a fact I only knew because I had once found her birth certificate while searching for information about her. The screen loaded slowly, and I prepared myself for disappointment, expecting to find a nominal amount, perhaps a few thousand at most. When the balance finally appeared, I blinked in disbelief, sure I was misreading the number or that the system had made an error. The account showed a balance of $25,786,429. I stared at the screen, unable to process what I was seeing. I refreshed the page thinking it must be a mistake. The same figure appeared. I logged out completely and logged back in again. The same enormous sum. The realization slowly dawned on me that this amount was more than double what my brothers had inherited combined. While they had received the visible assets, properties, and possessions valued at around 11 million, I had been given an account containing more than twice that amount. My hands still trembling, I looked again at the envelope, noticing for the first time that something else seemed to be tucked deep inside. I turned it upside down and shook gently. A second folded paper fell out, this one sealed with what looked like wax. I carefully broke the seal and unfolded what appeared to be a handwritten letter from my father. The first line made my heart skip. My dearest Callista, by the time you read this, I will be gone. The letter was written in my father's precise handwriting. The blue ink slightly faded on the high-quality stationery he had always preferred. I settled deeper into my couch, pulling a throw blanket around my shoulders as I began to read the truth that would reshape everything I thought I knew about my family. My dearest Callista, by the time you read this, I will be gone. There are truths you deserve to know, explanations owed for a lifetime of distance that was never your fault. I hope these words might begin to heal wounds I inflicted through my cowardice and weakness. Your mother Sarah was not merely my first wife as you've been told. She was my true love, my college sweetheart from our days at Boston University. We met during freshman year when she tutored me in English literature. She was brilliant, beautiful, and believed in education as a path to change the world. You have her eyes and her spirit, though you've never been told this. We married secretly during our junior year against my family's wishes. My father threatened disinheritance if I didn't break things off with Sarah, whom he considered beneath our family's station. She came from a working-class background, the daughter of a librarian and a factory worker. To the Bennett family, this made her unsuitable despite her intelligence and character. When Sarah became pregnant with you during our senior year, the pressure intensified. My father gave me an ultimatum: end the relationship or be cut off completely. At the same time, I was establishing connections with potential business partners, including Marianne's father, who suggested a strategic marriage to his recently divorced daughter would open doors in Boston's exclusive real estate circles. I made the decision that has haunted me every day since. I chose business success over standing up for the woman I loved and our unborn child. The plan was to quietly divorce Sarah after graduation, provide financial support, and establish my career through the connections Marianne's family offered. Then came the complication no one anticipated. Sarah developed preeclampsia in her third trimester. The condition worsened rapidly, and despite the best medical care money could buy, she died, bringing you into this world. In my grief and guilt, I nearly had a breakdown. It was during this vulnerable period that Marianne made her offer. She would accept you as part of the package, giving me the business connections I needed, but only if you were kept in the background. Your existence would be acknowledged, but never celebrated. You would be provided for, but never prioritized. In my weakness and ambition, I agreed to these shameful terms. It is the greatest regret of my life. What you don't know is that from the day of your birth, I began secretly building a fund for you. Every major deal I closed, I siphoned a percentage into offshore accounts under the guise of consulting fees. Over the decades, these investments grew substantially. The account information you now hold represents your true inheritance, free from Marianne's knowledge or influence. 3 years ago, I discovered something disturbing. Lucas and Dominic had been systematically embezzling from the company with Marianne's knowledge and approval. They had established shell companies that billed for non-existent services, directed company funds into personal accounts, and committed tax fraud that could have destroyed everything I built. When confronted privately, they showed no remorse. Lucas laughed and said, "I would never expose them because it would damage the company's reputation." Dominic suggested that since the money would eventually be theirs anyway, they were simply accelerating the timeline. Marianne defended them, saying they were showing initiative. I was preparing to take legal action when my cancer diagnosis came. The advanced stage of the disease accelerated my plans to protect you and ensure justice. The will reading you experience today was Theater Callista, a misdirection to protect your inheritance from those who would try to take it from you. The flash drive included with this letter contains extensive documentation of your brother's crimes. The private investigator who compiled this evidence, Daniel Walsh, is a former FBI agent who has worked for me for years. His contact information is included. He knows everything and will help you navigate what comes next. You may wonder about the message on the account information. This is for the child who was never supposed to exist. This refers not to my feelings about you, but to my family's attempt to erase you from the Bennett legacy. From the moment of your conception, forces conspired to prevent your existence. Yet here you are stronger and more principled than any of us. The truth that shames me most deeply is that, despite my failure to show it, you were always the child I loved most. Your kindness, intelligence, and integrity reminded me daily of your mother and the man I should have been. Every achievement of yours I dismissed publicly, I celebrated privately. Every school play I claimed to be too busy to attend, I watched from the back row, leaving before you could see me. I don't ask for forgiveness I don't deserve. Instead, I ask that you use this inheritance to live the life you choose, not the one others would force upon you. The company is yours if you want it, but so is the freedom to walk away entirely. Enclosed in this envelope, you'll also find photos of your mother that Marianne doesn't know exist. You'll see that she was an elementary school teacher before we met, a fact I was never allowed to share with you. The connection you felt to teaching was perhaps her final gift to you. I failed you in life, Callista. I hope in death I can finally give you the truth, security, and freedom you always deserved. With love and regret, your father, James Edward Bennett. I read the letter 3 times, tears flowing freely. The revelation was overwhelming, shifting the foundation of my understanding about my family and my place in it. Everything I had experienced, every slight and dismissal, suddenly appeared in a different light. The father I thought had never loved me had been living a complex deception, making choices I couldn't begin to fully comprehend. With shaking hands, I examined the small flash drive that had been tucked into the fold of the letter. Then I carefully removed several photographs I hadn't initially noticed. They showed a young woman with my eyes and smiles standing in front of a classroom of small children. Another showed her and my father, much younger, laughing on what appeared to be a college campus. The final photo showed her pregnant, glowing my father's hand protectively on her belly. These were treasures beyond price, glimpses of the mother I had never known and the father I never truly understood. At the bottom of the envelope was a business card for Daniel Walsh Investigations with a handwritten note. Call anytime. I've been waiting for your call for years. The emotional turmoil I felt was indescribable. Anger at the lifetime of rejection, even if part of a larger deception. Vindication in learning that my father had secretly valued me. Grief for what could have been if he had made different choices. Shock at learning about my brother's crimes and my stepmother's complicity. And beneath it all, a strange sense of connection to the mother I had never known. Discovering that my calling as a teacher might be an inheritance deeper than money. I studied the photos again, noticing details I had missed. My mother wore a pendant that matched one I had found in my childhood room years ago and still kept in my jewelry box. Her smile revealed a slight dimple on her right cheek, identical to mine, and her handwriting, visible on a chalkboard in one photo, had the same distinctive curve to the letter Y that mine did. The clock showed 3:00 a.m. when I finally put down the letter and photos. Outside, the rain had stopped and the night was quiet. For the first time since my father's diagnosis, I felt something like peace mixing with the complicated emotions. I had been left more questions than answers, but also the means to find those answers for myself. With renewed purpose, I picked up my phone and added Daniel Walsh's contact information. Tomorrow would bring a new chapter in a story I was only beginning to understand. But tonight I needed to process the revelation that the child who was never supposed to exist had been silently fought for, after all. The following morning, I called Daniel Walsh from the privacy of my apartment. Despite the early hour, he answered on the second ring with an alert voice, as if he had been expecting my call at exactly that moment. "Miss Bennett, I've been waiting for this call. I'm sorry about your father." His direct approach was refreshing after a lifetime of navigating my family's subtle manipulations. We arranged to meet at a small coffee shop in Cambridge, away from any of my family's usual haunts. I arrived to find a man in his early 60s with silver hair and alert eyes that missed nothing. He recognized me immediately. "You look like your mother," he said as I sat down across from him. Over the next 2 hours, Walsh revealed the full extent of what my father had discovered. For nearly a decade, Lucas and Dominic had been systematically stealing from the company through increasingly sophisticated schemes. They had established shell companies that billed for consulting services never rendered. They had manipulated property valuations to skim from transactions. They had even diverted company funds to support their lavish lifestyles while reporting them as business expenses. "Your father hired me 3 years ago when he noticed discrepancies in the company accounts," Walsh explained. "He wanted incontrovertible evidence before confronting anyone. What we found went beyond simple embezzlement to tax fraud, money laundering, and securities violations." According to Walsh, my stepmother Marianne had not only known about these activities, but had actively encouraged her sons, helping them cover their tracks and suggesting new methods to avoid detection. She had also been systematically isolating my father from longtime friends and business associates who might have noticed the irregularities sooner. "Your father was preparing to remove all 3 of them from the company when his diagnosis came," Walsh continued. "The timeline forced him to adapt his plans. Instead of a public reckoning that would damage the company's reputation, he created the elaborate misdirection you witnessed at the will reading." Walsh pulled out a folder containing documents showing that while my brothers had inherited the visible assets, the actual ownership of the company had been quietly transferred to a trust in my name months before my father's death. The properties they thought they controlled were actually owned by the corporation with them as minority shareholders, subject to board approval for any significant decisions. "The board meeting is scheduled for next Monday," Walsh informed me. "Your father's instructions were that his illness be used as the explanation for the delay. The board members don't yet know that leadership has transferred to you." I spent the weekend reviewing the extensive documentation Walsh provided and consulting with Barbara Holden, a prestigious attorney specializing in corporate and criminal law, whom my father had apparently retained on my behalf months earlier. With their guidance, I prepared for what would inevitably be a confrontation with my brothers and stepmother. What I hadn't anticipated was that they would come to me first. On Sunday evening, as I was reviewing board meeting protocols, an aggressive pounding on my apartment door startled me. Through the peephole, I saw Lucas and Dominic standing in the hallway, faces flushed with anger. Against my better judgment, but knowing this confrontation was inevitable, I opened the door. "So, the teacher suddenly becomes a multimillionaire," Lucas snarled, pushing past me into my apartment without waiting for an invitation. "Did you really think we wouldn't find out?" Dominic followed, looking around my modest apartment with exaggerated disgust. "One of Dad's banking contacts in Zurich called Marianne this morning. Apparently, there was a concern about unusual activity on a major account. Imagine our surprise when we learned about your little windfall." I closed the door, calmly, determination, replacing the fear I might have felt in the past. I imagine it was quite a shock. cut the innocent act, Lucas demanded. You manipulated a dying old man into changing his will. There's no way Dad would have left you that kind of money legitimately. The money is mine legally, as is the company, I replied, watching their expressions shift from anger to confusion. What are you talking about? Dominic asked, his voice losing some of its certainty. Bennett Real Estate Holdings is now controlled by the Calista Trust, I explained. Dad transferred ownership months ago. You can keep the houses and cars, but the company is mine. Lucas lunged forward, grabbing my arm. You're lying. This is some kind of sick joke. I pulled away, my voice steady. I'm not lying. And I know about the embezzlement, the fraud, the shell companies. I have all the documentation. Dad knew everything. The color drained from both their faces. Dominic recovered first, his expression shifting to a practiced charm I had seen him use on others, but never on me. Calista, let's be reasonable. We're family. Whatever you think you know, we can work something out. There's plenty for everyone. You can take that up with the SEC and the IRS. I replied, the documentation has already been secured with multiple attorneys. Lucas's face contorted with rage. You wouldn't dare. You'd destroy the family name. The family name you were so proud of when you were stealing millions from the company. That family name, I asked, finding strength I didn't know I possessed. You should leave now. My attorney will contact you tomorrow regarding the board meeting. They left with threats and promises of legal action, but I could see the fear beneath their bravado. For the first time in my life, I had stood my ground against them and watched them retreat. The following morning, I received notice that Lucas and Dominic had filed legal action, claiming my father had been mentally incapacitated when making his final arrangements. Their attorney, a long-time family connection, submitted affidavit from Marianne and several of her friends testifying to my father's confused state in his final months. What they didn't know was that my father, anticipating this exact move, had undergone extensive cognitive evaluation by 3 independent specialists who had documented his complete mental competence specifically to counteract such claims. Barbara Holden submitted these evaluations to the court along with video recordings of my father explicitly stating his wishes and explaining his reasoning. Simultaneously, Walsh provided evidence of my brother's wrongdoing to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Internal Revenue Service. Within days, both agencies had opened investigations. The story broke in the Boston business press. Bennett empire in turmoil air. A parent faces fraud charges. Daughter takes control. Overnight, what had been a private family matter became public spectacle. Former business associates distanced themselves from Lucas and Dominic. Social invitations to Marianne dried up as Boston society closed ranks against potential scandal. The board meeting I attended the following Monday was tense but decisive. Many board members had been longtime friends of my father who had suspected something wasn't right but lacked proof. When presented with evidence of my brother's activities and documentation of my legal control of the company, they voted unanimously to support the transition. Lucas and Dominic's attorney pushed for an emergency injunction to prevent me from taking control, resulting in a courtroom showdown that lasted 3 days. Barbara Holden methodically dismantled their case, presenting evidence of my father's careful planning and mental competence alongside documentation of my brother's financial crimes. Marianne took the stand tearfully, claiming that I had been estranged from the family by choice, that my father had been manipulated in his weakened state, that my brothers were devoted sons being persecuted unfairly. Her performance was compelling until Holden presented emails between Marianne and her sons discussing how to divert company funds without my father's knowledge. The decisive moment came when Walsh took the stand. His testimony, backed by financial records, surveillance photos, and recorded conversations, left no doubt about my brother's activities or my father's intentions. The judge ruled entirely in my favor, lifting the temporary injunction and allowing me full control of Bennett Real Estate Holdings. The criminal investigations proceeded quickly. Lucas, facing the most serious charges, including tax evasion and securities fraud, was arrested the following week. Dominic, who had been marginally more careful in his activities, negotiated a plea deal that included significant financial penalties but limited jail time. Marianne, while not charged, criminally faced civil penalties and the social humiliation that for her was perhaps the worst punishment. Through it all, I felt strangely detached, as if watching someone else's family drama unfold. The victory brought no joy, only a sense of justice being served, and my father's final wishes being honored. The child who was never supposed to exist had not only survived, but now controlled the empire that had been built at the cost of her childhood. The months following the court decision were a period of profound adjustment. I would wake up in my modest apartment, prepare for my teaching day, and then remember that I was now one of the wealthiest women in Boston. The cognitive dissonance was jarring. For weeks, I changed nothing about my daily routine, needing time to process not just my new financial reality, but the complicated emotional legacy my father had left me. In many ways, the money felt undeserved. I hadn't built the company or made the investments that generated this wealth. I had simply been born to a man who made terrible personal choices, but apparently loved me in his own dysfunctional way. The knowledge was both healing and painful, a bandage ripped from a wound that could finally begin to properly heal. After considerable thought, I began working with a therapist specializing in family trauma and sudden wealth transitions. Dr. Meredith Klein helped me navigate the complex emotions surrounding my inheritance, my father's revelations, and 32 years of family dysfunction. Through our weekly sessions, I began to understand that I could acknowledge my father's love while still holding him accountable for his failures. I could forgive without forgetting. I could move forward without erasing the past. Despite financial advisors suggesting I leave my teaching position, I chose to continue. The third graders in my classroom didn't care about my bank account or family drama. They cared that I knew their names, celebrated their achievements, and helped them when they struggled. The normalcy and purpose of teaching provided an anchor as other aspects of my life transformed dramatically. My first significant financial decision was establishing the Sarah Bennett Educational Foundation, named for the mother I had never known. With an initial endowment of $10 million, the foundation would provide scholarships for underprivileged children and support teacher training programs. Creating something meaningful from the inheritance felt like honoring both my mother's memory and my own life's work. Working with Barbara Holden, I began the process of divesting from the family's material excess. The Beacon Hill mansion, where I had grown up feeling like an unwelcome guest, was sold with proceeds divided between the foundation and cancer research. My brother's luxury cars were auctioned. The yacht sold to a tech entrepreneur from Seattle. I kept only items of genuine sentimental value, a few family photographs, my grandmother's pearl earrings, and a first edition of The Great Gatsby that had been my father's favorite book. Through Walsh's connections, I located several of my mother's former colleagues and friends. Over coffee and lunch meetings, I collected stories about Sarah Bennett that slowly built a picture of the woman whose life had been cut short, bringing me into the world. I learned she had a talent for watercolor painting, loved classical music, and had a laugh that could fill a room. I discovered she had volunteered teaching adult literacy classes on weekends and had planned to earn a master's degree in education after I was born. Most meaningful was meeting Eleanor Richardson, my mother's best friend from college, who recognized my mannerisms immediately. "You tilt your head exactly like Sarah when you're thinking," she told me, tears in her eyes and that laugh. My God, it's like hearing her again. She shared stories of my parents' early relationship, their secret wedding, their dreams for the future. For the first time, I felt connected to my mother beyond abstract knowledge of her existence. Despite my complicated feelings toward my father, I established the James Bennett Pancreatic Cancer Research Fund with $5 million from my inheritance. The disease that took his life remains one of the deadliest forms of cancer with limited treatment options and poor survival rates. Supporting research felt like acknowledging the complexity of our relationship, the good alongside the bad. The legal consequences for my brothers played out over the following year. Lucas was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison for tax evasion, securities fraud, and money laundering. Dominic, through his plea agreement, received 18 months in a minimum security facility, plus substantial financial penalties. The family empire they had tried to steal through fraud was instead transformed by the sister they had dismissed for decades. Marianne made several attempts at reconciliation, each more transparently motivated by financial interest than genuine remorse. When her social standing collapsed and her luxury lifestyle became unsustainable, She appeared at my office with teary apologies and reminiscences about family unity. I listened politely, then declined her request for additional financial support beyond what the court had determined was appropriate. "I don't hate you, Marianne," I told her as she prepared to leave. "That would require emotional energy. I'm no longer willing to invest in this relationship. I wish you well, but our paths diverge here." The journey toward forgiveness was not for them, but for myself. Carrying anger and resentment would only continue to give them power over my emotional well-being. Through therapy and reflection, I gradually released the bitterness that had been my constant companion, not because they deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved peace. On a crisp fall day about a year after the will reading, I encountered Margaret Donovan, our former next-door neighbor from Beacon Hill, at a charity function. She approached hesitantly, clearly unsure of her welcome given her long-time friendship with Marianne. "I have something I think you should know," she said after preliminary small talk. "Your father used to slip away from important dinner parties to watch your school performances. Marianne would make excuses for his absence, claiming business calls, but I saw him several times sitting in the back row at your elementary school, plays your high school orchestra concerts. He would leave before the crowds, but he was there." This simple revelation brought me to tears in the middle of the crowded event. It aligned with what my father had written, but hearing it confirmed by an outside observer made it real in a way his posthumous letter couldn't. He had been there watching from the shadows, unable to bridge the gap he had allowed to form, but unwilling to miss these moments completely. Over time, I came to understand that my worth had never been determined by my family's validation or lack thereof. The painful rejection I had experienced had shaped me, but it didn't define me. I found strength in creating my own definition of family through deep friendships and mentorship relationships that provided the emotional connections my biological family never could. The foundation became my primary focus beyond teaching. What began as a simple scholarship program expanded to include teacher training initiatives, after-school programs in underserved communities, and eventually a charter school focused on holistic education. The pain of my past was gradually transformed into purpose, creating opportunities for children who, like me, might otherwise fall through the cracks of family or society. 2 years after receiving that dusty envelope, I stood before the first class of Sarah Bennett Foundation scholarship recipients, 20 bright young students, who would receive fully funded education from elementary through college. Looking at their faces full of hope and potential, I felt a sense of completion. The cycle of pain had been broken. The child who was never supposed to exist had created a legacy of opportunity and compassion that would outlive her. Life continues to unfold in unexpected ways. The wealth itself never brought happiness, but the freedom to make choices based on purpose rather than necessity has been transformative. I've learned that family is not just defined by blood, but by love, respect, and mutual support. Sometimes the most painful experiences can lead us to our true path if we have the courage to face them honestly and the wisdom to transform pain into purpose. What would you do if you discovered that what seemed like your greatest rejection was actually your greatest protection? Have you ever had a moment when everything you thought you knew about your life suddenly shifted? Drop a comment below to share your story. If this resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share so others might find comfort in knowing they're not alone. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes what seems like an ending is actually the beginning of something far more beautiful than we could have imagined. Music.